Afternoon, everyone. Ooh, I don't need this. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing?
Great, great.
Awesome, awesome. Thank you so much for being here. Mr. Treasurer, we can call the roll.
All right, Mr. Brown? Here. Mr. Cole?
Present.
Green. Ms. Johnson? Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Here.
And Mr. Ragland?
Here.
You have a quorum.
Awesome. Before I get started, I wanted to take the opportunity to introduce someone who is very special and come into our ranks as of recent, and can definitely get an opportunity to get to know this wonderful individual. Her name is Miss Misty Nichols. She is our new board liaison with board services with the board. So welcome aboard. Please feel free to say hello and introduce yourself.
Hi, Misty. If you want to come say hello, you can come talk to me anytime.
All right. So just so you know as well, if you have the misadventure of not being able to contact any one of us directly, Misty is the person that you definitely want to connect with that can give you all the information you need, and she's an outstanding conduit. She's been with us only a few weeks, but has really settled in the role well. All right. With that, I want to allow for another introduction. Mr. Baker, Mr. President.
Mr. Chairman, I thank you. Speaking of connectivity, we have our new Chief Information Officer here with us. I think this is her first meeting. Her name is Vandana Virni. So please stand up so everyone sees who you are. This is our new CIO in the back there. Welcome.
Namaste. All right. So with that, we've called this meeting to order. Can we have an approval of the minutes? Is there a motion for that?
I'll make a motion to approve the minutes as presented.
All right. We have a motion and a second?
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
That motion carried.
All right, awesome, thank you. We can move right into monthly financial report. Mr. Treasurer?
Thank you. This is the report for November. This will be presented in a abbreviated format at the board meeting next Tuesday evening. So this is for the month ending November 30th. Total revenues this month came in about $513,000 under plan on $33.3 million estimated. We're now just shy of $7 million over plan in revenues, and that's about a 2% variance on $425 million of estimated revenue. On the total expenditure side, we came in about $985,000 under plan on $93.2 million planned this month. And year-to-date, about $17 million under on a plan of $384 million, about 4% variance. Ending cash is ahead by $23 million. We were planned at about, we're ahead at $23 million at $293 million over a plan of $270 million. Looking at the revenue highlights for this month, really just two items. One was state revenue, as I just discussed, and the other is that are kind of our perennial candidate for being overplanned, which is other revenues. Overplanned by about $600,000 this month, and again, mainly in the areas of tuition and investment income. The other revenues stand at $3.4 million favorable to plan year to date. I'll point out one other line item. It's extremely small. It's line 1.045. When you get into reading the reports, it's the restricted federal grants. This is the reimbursement for our qualified school construction bond interest on the debt that we have outstanding that has been issued in that way. We call the qualified school construction bond, you'll hear them called Q-Scoobies as the acronym. So that comes in a lump sum somewhere around this time of year. So inevitably I pick a month and it comes in a different month. So it's not like it's missing, it's just a timing issue. It's on its way. Just graphically, you can see here property taxes, state aid very much on target. Just statistically, property taxes and state aid represent about 90% of our year-to-date revenue. And that variance there, one's above, one's slightly below. The variance is really nil. It's 0.14%. in those two categories. So on 90% of our revenue, we're very much on target. All other revenues, the 10%, that's about an 18% variance, and we know where that is. I talked about that just earlier. This is all the other revenues in that category. You can see there on the far left that small little sliver for the QSCUBI interest. There's been no change in property tax allocation. That won't be several months before we see activity there again. I just talked about other revenues, and there's no change on the other financing sources. When we move to the expenditure side, personnel this month, I believe this was, that's interesting. I just noticed I have October highlights on there. Did I do the same thing on the other one? I did. So it's really November highlights. So much for search and change in a word processor. I look at this and I look at this and I always miss one somewhere. So anyway, this is November highlights. The expenditures personnel came in at 3.7 over for the month. We're now 6.8 million year to date under, and we know that as the new personnel got on and the wage increases got implemented, we still have some increases that we're going to expect some retro pay in December, but we're narrowing that variance down over time. Purchase services is pretty much the leading other non-personnel item for being under plan. It's under plan 1.1 for the month and about 6 million year to date. The leading categories there are professional technical services, property services, electricity, and tuition. If I could go back for a minute to personnel, just so you know, of that 3.7 million over plan for the month, 3.3 of it was in salaries and wages, about 300,000 in fringe benefits. Year to date of the 6.8 million that's under, I've been watching the split between benefits and salary and wages. There's about a 70-30 split in the plan and appropriations relative to the salaries and wages to benefits, but now the variance is about 46% attributable to salaries and wages and 54% of the variance to fringe benefits. So I'm looking at the fringe benefit line. I've got a pretty good idea where I think where that variance is coming from, and it has to do with our budgeting for the Cadillac tax, and that keeps getting pushed out. I got to make sure that our budget keeps getting pushed out. In fact, I'm probably going to recommend in the next round that we just take it out because I think it's going to go away, but they keep delaying it. And so I think that's, I don't think I delayed it this year, and that can be distorting that. So, and that line item is in the $5 to $7 million annual estimate for what that Cadillac tax could be. But again, I think that at the U.S. Capitol, there's some appetite, A, to eliminate it, B, to at least delay it. So we keep tracking it. I'm thinking that maybe we should just take it out. But we'll talk about that when we get to the forecast in the spring. Now let's see what else. Community schools pretty much unchanged from last month, running about 1.2 under plan year to date. And kind of an interesting thing this month that happened, and we can talk about accounting treatment for a little bit. As you may have read in the newspapers, the Franklin County Auditor decided to distribute funds out of the real estate assessment fund back to the political subdivisions that actually pay into that fund. So as part of their fees, when they provide the tax collection and settlement services for us, one of the fees they take out is for this real estate assessment fund, which is used to advertise delinquent real estate taxes and go through the collection process. That fund, I think, is somewhat discretionary for the county auditor, but they have typically issued a refund. Now, heretofore, the previous county auditor coincidentally issued that refund every 4 years. But this new county auditor has decided to do it. I see Board Member Ragland got my point. The new county auditor has decided to do it annually. The issue here is, what does that say to us for accounting treatment? Well, when we get a refund every 4 years, it it more than likely relates to expenditures that occurred in previous fiscal years. So in accounting parlance, that becomes a revenue item called, we're very creative in accounting in our nomenclature, it's called refund of a prior year's expenditure. But if we get a refund and it relates to a current year expenditure, because it's current, it's not really revenue. It's a reduction, it's a return of that expense. So we would treat that as a reduction in an expenditure. Well, everything the county auditor did, he did it within 1 year of the last one, and then he made a statement that he intends to do it annually, signaled to us that this is more of a current refund of current expenditures. Ergo, we should post this as a negative expenditure. So when you look in your reports, you'll see in the MD&A, you'll see the monthly chart actually goes negative because the refund in the general fund of the 1.568 million, 1.43 million went to the general fund, 118,000 went into the debt service fund, and the remaining 22,000 went into 2 permanent improvement funds because it went back to all the funds that receive property taxes and pay a proportional amount of that fee. So when you look at that chart, you'll see it goes negative for the month because there weren't a sufficient amount of other expenditures to keep it positive. For me, while I believe the accounting treatment is proper, obviously because that's the way we coded it, what it does is, if you look over time, gosh, I had the word. What was the word I was looking for? Not consistency, but that's the best word I can come up with. When you do I guess it's consistent. This treatment of this particular source doesn't seem to be consistent with what we did in the past when you look at the data. But from an accounting codification process, it's correct. So when we went back to look at it, I can go back on the revenue side and see exactly when the other 2 refunds came in. Now when we look at this, it's going to be on the expenditure side. So I just thought I'd share that with you. It's just kind of an accounting. I don't know that we would get dinged if the committee said, well, we want to be more consistent and let's record it as revenue. I don't know that we would get dinged for it necessarily. So I put that out to you if you think I should change it for consistency so that it shows up as a revenue item over time. But again, we're talking about $1.5 million to $2 million, kind of immaterial in the overall scope of things, but I just wanted to let you know that it creates what appears to be an inconsistency in how we treat this particular item.
Is there a difference in the amount? I mean, so he did $1.4 million this year. Had it been, $5 or $6 million every 4 years,
It was around 2.4 million in the previous refunds. So if you consider that was for ostensibly for a 4-year period, then that gives you about 600,000 a year. This time around, he distributed $1.5 million. $1.4 million went into the general fund. We don't look at that fund and assess the fund. He has to look at that fund and say, there are monies that can be returned, there aren't. And I have no idea what's going to happen in future years. But this amount seems large for 1 year, given the other amounts were 4-year amounts, and they were a little over $2 million.
Mr. Chairman, do you think that the Auditor of State might have a preference as to how we treat it?
I think it's immaterial. I could ask. I think it's immaterial.
As a follow-up, Mr. Chairman, I'll say sometimes they include things in their report which I believe are immaterial, but just food for thought.
Okay. I mean, I did not run it by them, but I could. They're still around here during our audit, so I could run it by them. And if they have an opinion, I'll let you know. But for now, we'll leave it as is, unless you really think for consistency I should change it. I would hate to change, and maybe it's a good question to ask, because I'd hate to change it, have them come in, and 10 months from now, tell me I need to make an adjustment. So I'll do that.
I think the recommendation to consider what the Auditor of State may see as, a proper compliance with regards to that is a good way to go, in addition to maintain communication with Mr. Stenciano's office as well, to see where we might take some guidance from them. I realize that when new people come in, they have a different style in which they do things. So I see it as that, and that's part of that immaterial side for me as well. But at the same time, I think it would be good for us to seek guidance and then adjust appropriately.
Will do. So that's really it on the expenditure side. You can see here on the graphically where our two largest areas for expenditures are, as you well know, personnel and our charter or community school deducts. Like I did on the revenue side, if I combine those two large categories, personnel and the charter school and related expenses, they come up to about 90% of our year-to-date expenses, and they have about a 2.3% variance, or about $8 million. All the other expenditure line items, representing about 10% of our year-to-date expenditures, they have an 18% variance. So I kind of did that weighted variance to make sure that that all factored into what is just about a 2.7% variance in expenditures. But notice, interestingly enough, in 90% of our revenue, or I'm sorry, 90% of our expenditures, we have an $8 million variance, and in the other 10%, we have an $8.5 million variance. So again, but it's just 10% of our expenditures, and we know where that lies. So just kind of proportionality breaking things out. Just another picture of how purchase services sticks out as an item of variance. The second from the right-hand category on this chart are the other objects, and that's where that negative expense was posted. When we look at variances on the revenue side, that's the graphical representation, but in the chart, all of the high variances, high categorized variances are in percentages, and they're in those revenue items that make up about 7% of our overall revenue. So again, I think we're very much on target in the revenue area. When we look at variances on expenditures, all of them are favorable. That is, they are under plan. So these are negative variances, if you will. And again, personnel this month, while still high in variance amount, it was $6.8 million, it is now low in percentage. It's under 5% variance. So that, as I said, that variance is narrowing down. Purchase services remains high in both categories. And you can see there that the rest, charter is low in both, and the rest of the categories that are much smaller in the overall contribution, there's just two of them, capital outlay and other objects, with a high variance percentage, but a very, very low dollar amount. So despite what two slides said, that's it for the monthly report for November, not October. I'll fix that, although those slides, I think those slides will be in the board presentation. So I'll fix that and repost it. But that concludes the monthly report for November.
Are there any questions at this point? All right. Thank you very kindly again. Moving right along to fiscal year 2020 budget requests. Mr. Gooding.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've got two items here this evening. We'll go through pretty quickly. The first one, I'm looking across the table at Dr. Dixon to see if she wanted to handle the first one. This is a singular FTE request for the Office of Technology for an executive assistant that we'll talk through.
Thank you. If you recall, I think a couple months ago I came and I shared with the team that when I was envisioning the organizational chart for the district, there was some important pieces that I omitted. And one was I increased the Chief of Information Officer. We've not had this position in the district, I think, for about 5 or 6 years. So I brought the position back on because we desperately needed a Chief of Information Officer. And we were blessed to find an amazing person from Battelle, who Board President Baker just introduced us to. But what was critical, that position didn't have an administrative assistant. that is critical to that work. And so we are looking at some different models where that we're sharing. We're going to do an assessment just to make sure we have the right administrative assistants, because we know the role is changed now. Many people are using this as their administrative assistants. But there's some pieces of work that we still need another person. So tonight I'm asking that we be allowed to add FTE so that that position will have an administrative assistant to accompany it.
The second item, as we were actually kind of talking with the tax refund piece, this is a slight change in how we have been accounting for Medicaid reimbursements. We've been part of a process where we can submit for reimbursement for eligible expenses, and Stan, jump in at any point if you want to. We've been receiving revenue for this. And from a transactional standpoint, the fee for that service has been offset against that revenue, so it's resided on the revenue side of our ledger. All we're proposing to do now, and we're making a change, and this has been going on for years and years and years of how we've been treating this and recording that transaction. We are proposing, starting in January, to move that fee for it. So you will see revenue go up and expense go up as well, because we're going to treat that as an expense. The fee will show up on the expenditure side. So overall, bottom line is not going to change anything. We're just changing how we're treating it as a transaction. So instead of it all residing on the revenue side, the revenue will be still revenue, even though higher than we've been receiving, and then you'll see the fee show up as an expense beginning in January. So we're asking for a $300,000 increase for the special ed budget. This will run from January through June of this fiscal year, and in the next budget process, you'll see an entire annualization of that in budgets going forward, beginning FY21.
Awesome. And this is, just a quick question, is this reform as a result of some collaboration between yourself and the internal audit?
I don't know whether we call it collaboration. It was part of her audit.
What he's saying is,
You see, I was trying to tee it up the right way.
Her staff comes in and says, "We don't like this. Why are you doing it that way?" And we went, "Okay, fine." So yeah, we collaborated.
Yes.
Yes.
So he's saying yes.
Okay, see, I'm trying to kill this adversary. It's all love here. All right. Thank you for that recommendation, Madam Auditor. Thank you. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. In addition to that, thank you for the update on and the request for the FTE for our new CIO.
Oh, yeah.
It's much needed, much needed. All right.
And then if the committee is okay moving this forward with a recommendation, then what we'll do is we'll take these changes and incorporate them into the amended appropriation resolution that the board will be presented with on the 19th.
Sounds like a plan. So is there a motion to accept the fiscal year 2020 budget request? We have a motion, and it is seconded.
Mr. Jordan?
Yes.
Mr. Miller? Yes. Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Yes.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
Motion carried. Thank you.
Next on the agenda is our Ed Choice Scholarships. Mr. Treasurer.
Thank you. This next topic is just a kind of a update, discussion, information piece to the committee. So really that you know that we are well aware of what's going on in this topic that you may have heard about, whether it's in the newspaper or at the Ohio School Board's Capital Conference. But this is all about the Ed Choice Scholarship Program. And I get my chart up here. Eric and I, Dr. Roush and I, will kind of tag team this. We don't have anything scripted other than to try and walk through a little bit of background about what Ed Choice Scholarship is, how it's handled, what's going on here currently with some of the change in eligibility, and the impact that it has had on our district. So at the foundation, Ed Choice Scholarship Program is in this state called a scholarship. In every other state, it's called a voucher. so that you get your head around the concept. It is a mechanism by which students that are attending eligible schools, and eligible schools are those that are low performing by some definition and criteria. So those parents have the option to take their student out of that low performing school and put them in a private school and carry with them a certain dollar amount, a voucher. This program began in 2006, 2007 school year. I'm borrowing from Howard Fleeter's presentation. And there was also a second program called the Ed Choice Expansion Program, which began in the 2013-14 school year. They're similar, but yet different. The original Ed Choice Scholarship Program is funded through deductions from the local school district. So similar to community schools, there is, we count them, and then they take them out as a deduction. And this scholarship appears in the same line that we call community schools. It's object code 478 and 479 in our accounting system, which we add together and refer to it as, I always call it, charter et al. It's other scholarships, because there's also a John Peterson scholarship and an autism scholarship, but by far community schools and Ed Choice are the larger in dollar amounts. So that's how the original Ed Choice program works, is by deduction from us as a district. The Ed Choice Expansion Program has a different qualification criteria, and that's income. It's income-based. But that one is paid for directly by the state. So they budget for that, and they pay for it directly. And they tend to intertwine with one another. After you look at the qualification over here, I think there can be some spillover. We'd like to reverse the order of that, but Eric will speak to that legislative part of it. So that's kind of the background of where we are. So here most recently, and then I'll let Eric go, is there's been a change in eligibility criteria, and we'll just briefly talk about that because it gets very convoluted, but there's been change. And what's happened is all of a sudden more districts many districts that have never been involved in Ed Choice got drawn into the fray. And now they have these deductions. And so if you can imagine from my position, I've seen historically Ed Choice, and I trend it. I go, okay, we expect to pay more because this door swings one way only. In other words, once a child qualifies, applies, is awarded a voucher, it stays with them. So I might have qualified because the ABC school was an eligible school or a designated school. I qualify, I get the voucher and send my kid off to school over here. 3 years later, 4 years, the next year, whatever, the ABC school improves. They're no longer designated. Voucher program doesn't care. I qualified, that child gets that scholarship for as long as they're in the K-12 system on the private side. It stays with them. So this door swings only one way from us. So from a cost standpoint, it generally always goes up. The best case would be that all of our schools don't get designated. And 13 years later, after the kindergartner has carried that voucher all the way through and leaves, our deduction would go to zero. So from a planning standpoint, I trend it and I go, I doubt that it's ever going to go away. It might slow down, but it's not going to go away. And so that's how we look at it. If I'm at a school that never hit the qualification, never had the deduction, I might not think about planning for it. So all of a sudden in FY19 and 20, when they look at the criteria, they go, holy cow, I've got this many schools, this many kids that are going to potentially qualify and leave the district. It's an expense they weren't expecting. I have an adage about problems that I personally have or that we might have as a district. If you want somebody else to help you address them, you have to make your problem their problem. And so when I was in the meeting, I was sitting with Eric and Scott, both of whom had their hand on my thighs, keeping me from standing up and yelling at the meeting, welcome to my world where your revenue is limited, but your deductions go up. disproportionately, so I didn't really say anything, but I had that feeling that, welcome to our world, and now you want to storm the Bastille, is what I said, because our problem has become your problem in a very similar way. Or let them eat cake, that's Antoinette. But, so I'm going to let Eric talk more about the changes and the positions of the other districts, some legislative ideas, and then I'll get back to kind of the impact and tell you what these numbers have looked like for us, and why it is impacting us, but it's not as material as it might be for some other school districts.
Thank you. So a couple of years ago, they changed the criteria. This is another biennial appropriations bill. On top of that, then they put everybody into a safe harbor, which is why I think most school districts never really witnessed anything or realized it, because when we went into safe harbor, there was kind of a pause button put on for several years as far as any additional schools going into eligibility. We essentially went from two criteria with an and. So you had to meet both the criteria. To now there are 6 separate criteria, and you only have to meet one of those criteria. And so you know, we went by a threefold with the number of criteria, and instead of having to meet both of those, and we now have an or situation. Coupled with that, because of the way they crafted the language with safe harbor, which was helpful for districts for a while, old data is being used for the calculation. You have to be in for 2 of the 3 most recent years. So for the 19-20 school year, we're using the 18-19 data, the 17-18 data, and then the 13-14 data. Because of the middle period of the safe harbor, you couldn't count those years by law. So you have to go all the way back to get that third year to the 13-14. So for those schools that are, those high schools that are eligible, most of those students are now in their 20s because it was, it's based on graduation rate. This last biennial budget, we were given a couple of additional surprises in conference committee, one of which was opening up that anybody who would be at an eligible high school, meaning that the graduation rate, they got a D or an F in graduation for 2 of those 3 years, whether you never ever set foot in a Columbus City school or any public school would be eligible for an Ed Choice voucher. So students who are already perhaps going to a private school suddenly are now eligible for these particular vouchers. And so I think that, I think as we get to the data, you'll see that there is an increase in the number of high school students that are attending. Those are some of the key kind of statutory changes. A number of districts, as Stan mentioned earlier, this is new to them. They weren't viewing this, and it's because you have all these new criteria that are kind of bringing them into the fold. So you have districts, and they've thrown out a number of examples where they may have A's across the board, but they have one school building that has an F and a value added, and welcome to the club. And so what we've gone is just a handful of school districts, mostly poorer urban districts, to now, I'd have to look at the number again, but I think, what was it about, we're up to about close to 400 districts now, or about 1,200 schools? So it's greatly expanded. And then you look at even next year. And so that's why there's been a lot of consternation. I think you've seen a lot of meetings, a lot of media presence right now, because the application window opens up February 1st of 2020. And so I think what you have is you have a lot of individuals now, you have a lot of districts trying to come up with a legislative fix, and that legislative fix has a very small window because we're in the second week of December. General Assembly is ostensibly done next week. The House does not come back to full session until the last week of January. So any fix they have, they've got to move fairly quickly. It will involve an emergency clause to do that. On the plus side, at least on the legislative front, there seems to be a great willingness to try to craft a fix. What that fix will be, I think, is still in the discussion phases. There's a lot of different ideas being bandied about around Capitol Square right now. But I know that Senator Huffman, who put the language in helped get the language crafted and inserted into the budget bill, he's working on this, and so. He realizes, I think, that it didn't quite work out as well as he was hoping it would, although he also blasted school treasurers in plain dealer articles saying that they all should have known this was coming. But he seems amenable to working and crafting a fix. The House seems to be wanting to really try to put something together as well. So that's where we are legislatively, is that's where, it takes a legislative fix at this particular point in time, and even then, as Stan said, will be a while before really a lot of the effects of that may be realized. Also compounding this is the fact that we're essentially flat funded. If you remember, the wellness dollars are not in the 5-year forecast. All the rest of the state funding is flat funded, and so those deductions continue to come out. So if you're a school district who's flat, and now all of a sudden you have this large increase in deductions coming out of you, it's making the situation quite untenable for a number of districts, particularly up in the northeast part of the state.
So the data that we got the other day, in FY19, the number of Ed Choice districts, the number of districts affected by Ed Choice, were 41. In FY20, that jumped to 164, and the projection for FY21 is 423. So
610 in the state.
That's correct. Yeah.
So that's why there was this big hubbub about how this change in criteria may have had perhaps some
The building numbers.
unintended consequences. In FY19, the number of buildings that were in Ed Choice were 120. The projection for 21 is 1,227 buildings, over 10 times as many. So that's why they're up in arms. Now, for us, I don't like the way we do deductions on anything. I think if the state thinks it's a good idea, they should jolly well pay for it. But that being said, because of the way we project and trend, just to give you some data, I went back to FY15 and compared it to FY20. During that time period, we went from 3,923 K-12 students in the program to 5,688, an increase of about 1,765 students. Albeit the largest increase was in 20, it was 616 students. The low was 169 students in 1 year, and we averaged about 352 children additional each year going into Ed Choice. So this year, larger, yes. Enough to really throw off my trend? Not really. Our deduction went from 17.1 million in FY15 to an estimated 28.4 million this year, about an 11.3 million increase over that 5-year period. So the largest increase we experienced was actually in year-over-year increase was actually in fiscal 17 at 3.6 million. This year, the increase is about 3.4 million. So none of that, when we do the forecast, none of that really jumps off the page at us. We know that it's increasing, but we had it in the forecast. So that's why, in general, as I said at the beginning, in general, I don't like the way they fund all of this anyway. It's not the incremental change to us. It's the fact that it's there at all that bothers me. What got everybody else's attention was they didn't have it, and now they've got 10 times the number of buildings that are involved. So we're in this fight for, I think, different reasons. I would prefer to argue on the more fundamental, if you think this is a good idea, you pay for it. I don't know if that's how you put that into legislation, but that's kind of been our approach, and especially when we talk about the new funding model, the Cupp-Patterson model, I think really relies on funding community schools, charter schools, separately. But there's a whole legislative battle and some very political reasons why certain folks don't want to do that. But
Treats vouchers the same way in 305 in the Cupp-Patterson plan. They do away with the deductions. The deductions go away. Everything is funded by the state and funded directly. So. And and the thinking has evolved over time, I would say, as you add on there. This battle will continue to rage on, but there are even some, I think, within the charter community, et cetera. I mean, I know this is a voucher discussion, but even they have said at this point, there are a number of the individuals there who say it's time to direct fund this, that the deductions are causing lots of problems that don't necessarily need to exist.
So I wanted the committee You may have heard of it being talked about out there. I wanted to make sure that you knew that we were looking at it. Eric and I just spent an hour today with Dr. Klein from Accountability, and I had to believe it or not, rein in Dr. Roush and Dr. Klein and bring it down to something that we could, in fact, talk about, because it was too much statistics and comparability and dicing the data, and well, what about and it was like, I got lost, and I think I'm pretty good at it. So if you want more data, you can have it, but I wanted to let you know, and hopefully it suffices to say that we are looking at the data, but we believe that the information we have is best to help support a legislative solution, because from an accounting forecasting standpoint, that's not the issue. The issue is that this deduction exists and the way it handles in the first place. So we're on it in a way, but I just wanted to give you that report so that, you know, if somebody asks, you can say, yeah, we planned for it, it is an impact, but fundamentally, we don't like the way it's being handled. So I hope that helps. If you have any questions, let us know.
Mr. Ragland?
Certainly. So you mentioned that you said the door doesn't swing both ways. What happens if a family takes a scholarship and moves to a scholarship school, but chooses to come back to Columbus?
They wouldn't need the voucher.
So would we still lose that
No,
revenue?
no, it would come back to us.
So,
Yeah,
then, okay, so then.
If they all came back,
If they-
the
if they-
voucher
if
would
they-
all go away.
Right, if they came back, we're not missing anything.
That's correct, right.
Okay.
It's like, it's the same with the community school. If if all the children from community schools came back,
Right.
then we wouldn't have that deduction.
Okay, so my next question would be, have we identified where the students who are currently using the scholarships would be going if they stayed here in Columbus?
And you should have joined us at 11 o'clock, because that's exactly the question we asked. That's a question. And I think Dr. Klein said that she can pull the students, their ID numbers.
Right.
And
In order to identify the student and kind of the attendance area from which they would come and from which they'd be pulled, she can do that. She'll have to essentially do VLOOKUPs on the SSID, on those individual student ID numbers in order to do that. We know where they go. We know on the SFPR, the schools to which they go, we have that number on an FTE basis or an ADM basis. We have the number. We don't have their SSIDs are not part of the financial reporting. So we really got to look at you really got to look at her system and look at it by SSID in order to determine from which those, and even on the SFPR, we know the number that go to the school. We don't know which students attend that school. We have to go to her system to pull that report and that data.
so the short answer is, no, we don't know that right now.
Right.
But the long answer is that
We can get
data,
it. We can get it.
with some work and calculation, we could figure that out.
Dr. Dixon? I'm
sorry.
I'm sorry.
No, absolutely.
No, I was just sharing, so my former district, we had a lot of students with Ed Choice, so we kept those records in my former district. So we just probably won't, because of the number of students, I mean, far exceeds my former district, but we had those numbers, because we had a recruitment strategy. So we were intentional trying to figure out why students were leaving and trying to capture those students back in the district. So we knew exactly who were leaving and what schools they were supposed to be attending and what schools they were attending. And we had a specific strategy of trying to get those students back. So if that list, I'm sure, but that list here, compared, right, you know.
How many
it's just-
students, what's the student count at Cleveland Heights? I don't know how big it is.
Total?
Yes.
About 5,500 students.
And we have almost
Like,
50
right, right.
5,700 children leaving
Exactly,
our
right,
district.
yeah.
We have an entire school district.
A
that
kind of school
went
district, yeah.
over.
That's just.
That's just a,
Choice. You had
That's just a choice.
there as
not
well,
right.
and suddenly you're
then
at
you.
20-some
yeah,
thousand.
Yeah.
Not saying that it's insurmountable, but it would be
Right.
something that we'd
But-
have to.
But, right, it
pull
would
that
pull it,
data.
but it wouldn't be the, yeah, it would be a lot of work to pull it from our district. The scale,
I
you're
understand
right.
that. I think from my perspective, what I would like to see is for us to know in detail where the children who are accepting the scholarships are coming from, and then overlay that with our study on equity and make sure that we're understanding how equitable distribution of resources within the district might or might not be driving families to utilize this option. I think it would be good data to keep. I understand that it's probably a Herculean effort to get that going. However, and it doesn't sound like this is going away, that's the type of data that we will be needing to keep in order to identify where we need to be putting our areas of focus with the resources that we do have. So that would be my suggestion as we look at it.
And since I won't be doing the work, it would be, because if we do it for this group, that's just a group that's on vouchers. You've got a much larger group for community schools. So if you're thinking about a what did you call the strategy? Recruitment strategy?
Right, it would just start it, well, it would be helpful, like it makes more sense to start it with your incoming kindergartners, right? So because for 13 years at your state, you might as well put that in your that's a loss
Yep.
perhaps, unless you're gonna get some students coming back. But you think about where your kindergartners are living and those schools that they will be going to, right? And then if you, and where those families are living, and that's how you kind of start, and say, well, those kindergartners, if they're in pre-K, for example, so we have 10,000 students in our pre-K programs. So, and we don't get any funding for our pre-K because those are outside dollars. But how many of your pre-K students are going to stay in your school district? Or how many of your pre-K students are going to use a voucher, right? And then go somewhere else. And then because that school, that even though they're in that school for a pre-K, it may be a low-performing school, they're not going to stay there if they know they can get a voucher and go somewhere else, right? So it makes more sense, I would think, to start that strategy with your pre-K, your pre-K and your kindergarten families, because those are ones that, especially your pre-K students that may not stay with you.
And you also have, they go to, and Eric, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you can bifurcate the schools that they go to as community schools, in that one instance, not for vouchers, but community school kids, they go to community schools, private schools. The vouchers, 100%, go to religious-based schools?
There are some private schools that I think are not religious based that are on the voucher list. The vast majority of them are. I mean,
So I point that out because I would think, as a parent, going to a community school might have a different set of reasons than my choice to go to a religious-based school. I'm just making a guess. So you know what I'm saying?
It's a certain dollar amount, so you only get,
It's a portion.
you only
There's a
get a
gap.
certain portion of that. You only get the state's portion of that dollar.
The state sets a dollar amount for what, K through 8 and 9
K
through
through 8,
12?
so you don't, right.
And then it's the voucher or the tuition, whichever is
Right.
lower, right?
it is the voucher, the tuition, whichever is lower. However, most of the schools have figured out to set the tuition around where the voucher amount is, and then apply any other kind of aid after that fact. And it's $4,650 for K to 8 and $6,000 currently for high school.
I'm just saying that you've got, you can get similar data, but I think some of the reasoning might be different because it is unique when you look at the schools, the preponderance of religious-based schools for the vouchers and then the more private schools for community schools. But I think there's two different reasons or other reasons. You might not be able to attract the kids that go to the parochial schools. They're going there for other reasons. The voucher is just kind of handy. I don't know. That's
That's a-
anecdotal.
a fair amount of
and I have no
speculation.
data to support that other than just looking at it. And, you know, the folks I went to school with, voucher or no voucher, they were going to Watterson. And I went to Whetstone. So,
Well, I mean, with that in mind, I guess the idea here in this discussion specifically is that we are now in another space where, because this environment has increased the eligibility threshold, we're now in a space where we have to do even more long-term looking at the effect of transiency, the effect of, what was the word? The effect of trending in terms of what is going to be the overall financial impact of these deductions. So we have to take a much more deeper dive look at deductions over time. Is that correct?
yes, and, you know, in terms of student recruitment, if we ever get to a funding model that actually funds us fully for a child and doesn't deduct from us for a child that isn't here, there's still a motivation to recruit, because if they come to us, they come with the state aid. You know, you still, you know, this isn't just a cost avoidance. If we ever get to the right kind of model, it can be they come with state revenue. You know, it could be on the revenue side. Right now, everything that we do relative to these scholarships and community schools is a reduction of an expense effort, not a revenue generating effort, because we're capped or flat funded. See what I'm saying?
Yes, sir, Mr. Ragney.
My question, and this is probably more to Dr. Dixon, do you know how many buildings we have on the scholarship eligibility list within the district?
That comes, we can get all of that. They give you all of those questions you answered should be in our EMIS information.
Yeah, I didn't pull those spreadsheets up. Do you remember
Yeah.
off the top of your head? I know in the last couple of years, we added,
The question was how many we've added or where we are right now?
Where we are right
For
now.
2021, we're looking at 100 schools. We are sitting at around 80. This is my problem when I run different scenarios for different things I've been running. We're somewhere in the low to mid 80s currently for this school year. A year prior, we were in the high 60s.
Great.
So 100 out of 109 of our buildings are scholarship eligible, is what you're saying, for 2020?
For 2021, if the criteria remain the same, keeping in mind that there is work at the General Assembly currently to modify said criteria, which could then lower that amount.
Any additional questions, thoughts? Does this conclude the update?
yes, I was just wondering if I should pull that spreadsheet, but no, that's it.
Mr. Brown?
For me, yes.
You know, I saw this and was looking at it this morning.
Sorry, maybe.
Coincidental to not knowing it was on your agenda for today, and saw 100 schools. And I guess I feel better knowing that this is good news in some ways, because we're going to get help to address this issue. And it sounds as though that, you know, there's a decent chance that we're going to get some help, and from other schools and then from the General Assembly. So, yeah, that's good.
I'm not too sure about that, and certainly not to turn this into a diatribe at all. I'm not so sure about that. I think this creates an even more competitive environment, number one, because now you've got so many additional schools competing for these same type of dollars. In addition to that, we've always taken it on the worst end as this type of situation continues to grow and increase. This funding model and these new contrived funding models do nothing but hurt us. They continue to hurt us. They continue to put additional fiscal stress on us in a way that has us relying much more every cycle on local tax dollars that we still haven't fixed and adjusted that situation either. So I don't know that I'm encouraged at all under these circumstances. I feel like this has opened the door even wider to say that more of your schools are failing, so you can make more of your kids eligible to leave you. Number two, this opens the door to losing students with resources that will directly follow them elsewhere. I just don't see where there's a success factor unless we really fix the fundamental issue of local tax funding and how we are going to make that situation right so that we can continue to be solvent without having to always rely so much on that. When I started on this board, we were 46%, something like that, 46, 47% of our revenues came from the state. 50 some odd percent of our revenues came locally. Today, 36, 37% of our funding comes from the state. And the greater majority of that is relying on Joe taxpayer like you and me and you and everybody else who lives in the city of Columbus to rely on that for our schools to operate effectively. I'm not encouraged by this at all. I think we need to drill down, quite honestly, and this is a conversation for another committee, but I think that we do need to drill down with an aggressive strategy for recruitment, with an aggressive strategy for where we tease out what type of population of students we want to target, whether it is pre-K, whether it is K through 8 or 9 through 12, whether it's gifted and talented, based on funding that could be available federally and statewide. I think there's opportunity here for us to look out and look at how we tease demographically what kind of student we want to look at, geographically where we want to look. To me, I'm not encouraged. I think the only area I am is I'm just more encouraged to fight a little harder.
Yeah, I would say to add to that, I would just want us to be mindful that all of this is associated with school success in those report cards. So if you think about how do we get here, right? And if we are basing funding to student outcomes and allowing students to move to other districts that are performing better, and then not putting the resources or the attention on to how demographics are changing. And, we have a lot of students that are transient, right? So now we have students that are moving out of the Columbus area. They're moving to our suburbs and our suburban districts. Their demographics are changing and their students are not responding well to their academic curriculums, right? So now you put this label on these school districts, and what happens? They lose funding because of those labels, because now people take this funding and go somewhere else. So I think it's a deeper issue that we just have to put in the forefront when we're saying that if we're going to advocate for equity for all, then part of that is not just robbing Peter to pay Paul. I mean, we're in a place where Columbus City Schools is not getting the proper revenue from the very beginning. And we have a state that's trying, the state is trying to find a funding model, and they're working to find something better, but still, Columbus is still excluded out of that. And I think Stan has said before, if we're gonna get a funding model that's right, then make Columbus whole. Right? And so I think there's some deeper issues, some concerns that we as a board, I agree, that advocacy piece on what's the right funding model, how do we rate our schools? Is it a report card? Is it a letter grade? Is it something else? Because all of those ingredients is making up this cupcake, right? So I agree with just some continued discussions are greatly needed.
Yes, Mr. Reck.
I do think that this is the appropriate committee to have these discussions, because there's a cost impact to everything that we do with this. If we have 100 schools that are on the eligibility list, that gives us an opportunity to improve 100 schools, to get them off the list and market those improvements to the students who are currently or would consider moving elsewhere in the future. That's a huge opportunity for us to celebrate the success that is happening within our buildings on a day-to-day basis. If we can target what we're doing to those parents who are considering those other options, and then be a little bit more creative about what we incentivize to move folks into the district itself. I think there are some opportunities for us to use what we have to increase what we're getting in property tax revenue. We should have incentive programs for staff that currently don't live within district boundaries to move back into the district. There are some opportunities in doing that. That could be something that could get our folks that aren't currently utilizing district schools for their own children to double our pleasure, right? They move back into Columbus, we get the property tax revenue. They send their children to our schools. We get the per pupil funding from them. I mean, there are all sorts of things that we can consider, but the highest impact for us financially would be, like Stan said, if the students move back into our schools, we get those resources back. That is the place where we should be focusing. How are we competing to make certain that our schools are a viable option? Because for me, what this boils down to is the state has created an opportunity for parents to leave, and they're choosing to do so. And if we stop that, then we're not having a discussion about anything else. And so how we market those improvement strategies that we have in place, who we market them to already, that's going to end up with some positive financial impact for us. So, you know, I think the discussion goes across all lines within the district, but I do feel that this is the important place to be having this because, you know, folks need to realize the impact that is occurring, but we also need to realize the why and fix that, and I think that's our biggest opportunity.
I thank you, Mr. Ragland. Yes.
Before we can figure out how we get people back, we have to know why they leave. That's the starting point. And if you look, it was the early teens or the aughts, Kids Ohio, which is no longer around, did a study of the Linden Park area, Wineland Park neighborhood, as to why so many of those students were not enrolled in their home schools. So that's a good part to start at. One of those reasons was discipline, which still exists today.
Right, I thank you. I don't want to get off track because at the same time, I understand the larger argument of fiscal implication, which is where that conversation rests, right? The bigger part, the more cross-cutting part of this conversation deals with curriculum, deals with student attendance, deals with myriad issues that would, in my mind, ideally be taken up in a new academic committee. Would be taken up in innovation and reform. Any number of our opportunities to work collaboratively to have that discussion and then bring direction for the superintendent and treasurer to act on appropriately. So if there isn't any more, I'd love to have the opportunity to call for an adjournment. Mr. President, Mr.
If
Baker.
I might, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to recognize James Barnes, who came in. He is our new general counsel. Would you mind standing, Mr. Barnes, and lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance? Yes. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
No, thank you for joining us, Mr. Barnes, and welcome to the district. All right, is there a motion for adjournment? All right.
So, Mr. Miller?
Yes.
Mr. Ragland?
Yes.
Mr. Brown?
Sure.
Mr. Cole?
Yes.
And Mr. George?
Yes.
That motion carried. About 5:11.
Thank you all for joining us.